but I feel adventuresome. I don't think I'm just going to stop, sit down. I don't necessarily mean singing, or I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a writer, I'm just, I guess I'm a performer, but I feel creative. I feel I need to be around people. I like it now. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop.
Sound of a wheel, the colors you bring, the voice of movement, the sound that rings, learn the words, all else fails.
past 6 months, but I feel adventuresome. I don't think I'm just going to sit down. I don't necessarily mean singing, or I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a writer, I'm just, I guess I'm a performer, but I feel creative. I feel I need to be around people. I like it now.
Good afternoon. I'm Andrea Ritchie, and I have the incredible honor and joy of helping to weave together a conversation today about moving from dreams to practice to abolition in our lifetimes. Grace Lee Boggs, whose revolutionary spirit has infused the Allied Media Conference in person and as an ancestor, taught us to ask, what time is it on the clock of the world? And what feels like it's becoming clear is that it's abolition time. The police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and the continuing epidemic of violence against Black trans women that took the lives of Breonna Hill, Nina Pop, Mercy Mack, Remy Fells, and Rhea Hilton, among so many more, have sparked one of the largest, longest, and most sustained uprisings in US history, which has been characterized both by brutal repression and by brilliant and beautiful resistance. Growing numbers of people are coming to the conclusion that it's just not possible to reform a system that's set up to kill us, that perpetrates violence instead of protecting us, and that's looting money and resources from the things we need to survive a global pandemic, an economic crisis, and climate change. The demand is to defund police, defend Black lives, and invest in what will actually keep our communities safer. From the pages of the New York Times to the front lines, abolition is on the lips and in the hearts and dreams of unprecedented numbers of people. And in this moment of uprising for our lives, we're living in the dreams of enslaved Africans, the dreams of indigenous people incarcerated on reservations on their own lands, the dreams of disabled people incarcerated by ableism in our communities and in psychiatric and nursing facilities, the dreams of Native people and migrants incarcerated by borders, and the dreams of people who sparked prison rebellions in the 60s and 70s as mass incarceration took hold, and of people now in cages. We're living in the dreams of people who are on house arrest, who are shackled by electronic monitoring, people who are separated from their families by borders, by bars, and by the judgments of the foster system, and in the dreams of parents and children for schools that are sites of learning, nurturing, and community, not surveillance, policing, and punishment. The Allied Media Conference has always been a place where we've dreamed and practiced new worlds, and where we sparked and catalyzed each other's imagination through every form of media, from the dance floor to the computer room, and through the creating and growing safer communities, the creative collective access, and the healing justice tracks and practice spaces, and through the AMC safety team. As a writer, I've personally been invited into imagining abolition through visionary fiction by those calling us to create new futures without police and prisons, and to eliminate new strategies of resistance. And drawing on the teachings of Black feminists, visionary fiction writers, and abolitionist organizers at the AMC also remind us that the process of radical world building required to bring abolition into being must be irresistible, joyful, and pleasurable. As the AMC teaches us, building a world without police, prisons, and punishment should be a process that I've heard a few people describe as abolitious. And as the legacy of revolutionaries from Che to Asada, to Grace and Jimmy Boggs, to Charity Hicks illuminates, it's a process that must be deeply rooted in love. So I want to start today's conversation by inviting two brilliant people who I love, who have been helping us dream abolition and put it into practice for over 2 decades. And then we're going to be joined by some more brilliant organizers from Minneapolis, Detroit, and Atlanta. I'm going to invite you to read everyone's bios online because they're long and accomplished, and all of them have started and been part of so many formations that brought us to this moment. So I'm going to start with you, Rachel Hertzing. And I'm starting with you because Rachel likes to stay out of the spotlight, but most of us have learned abolition from something she helped create without knowing it. Rachel's one of the founders of Critical Resistance and a longtime staff person there, and now the ED of the Center for Political Education. And Rachel is the person who organized me to full abolition in 2004 in the old Critical Resistance office on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland. Angela Davis had prepared the ground in 1999 when she came to Toronto, where I was living at the time, and laid down the case for prison abolition. I was like, whoa, we can just get rid of the whole thing instead of fighting to reduce the harms? Like, is that that's really possible. But it was really you, Rachel, who brought abolition, particularly of policing, home for me and organized me out of my last holdout, which was wanting to prosecute cops who harm people as someone who's a survivor of sexual assault by a police officer. And you taught me that once we concede that some people belong in cages, it's a slippery slope that inevitably leads and ends with people with the least power in cages. And so that we really have to practice imagining abolition and accountability with the people we most think need to be punished in order to really dream a new world where cages are not possible. So I just want to thank you publicly for all the ways you've taught me abolition and all the ways you've taught so many people I know abolition without maybe knowing about it. And so with that, I just want to ask you, where do our abolition dreams come from, and how did critical resistance come into being and seed those dreams into practice?
Thanks so much for having me this morning. It is morning where I am in Oakland, California. And I want to just give a quick shout to the Allied Media Conference and all of the people who have worked to put it together for all these years and for really upholding abolitionist politics, as Andrea had laid out in that beautiful opening. So I say frequently, because it is true, that I am not an historian of abolition. I am not a historian of the prison industrial complex. I'm also, it turns out, not a historian of critical resistance. So I will tell you what I think and what I know to those questions, Andrea.
All the questions are for you.
I think abolition dreams come from life, from reality. I think there's sometimes this idea that it's like science fiction and utopia, as if science fiction and utopian thinking are not productive things. But I think it really comes from the experience of people not wanting to see people punished in particular kinds of ways, right? So most of us probably know that prisons themselves are a reform. They were meant to replace corporal punishments, right? Like the stocks or like the rack or public executions, that kind of thing. And they were meant initially, the penitentiary system was meant initially to be a place for quiet reflection, right? So you could think about what you had done and get closer to your God and that kind of thing, or to the Quaker God in that case. And, almost immediately, the Quakers, who are responsible in part for the first set of penitentiaries in the United States, were like, nah, no thanks. This is a bad practice, and almost immediately started trying to eliminate their use. And ever since then, there have been people trying to eliminate the use of imprisonment. And I think, the kind of way that we think about punishment, what it is for, who it is for, is really embedded in a spirit of liberation that kind of courses through probably human history, but for sure here in the United States where we're talking, I know that is true. So I think those dreams come from people's lives, from people having care and concern for people who they love, care and concern for the people they live around, and wanting to understand different ways of engaging with antisocial behavior, things that happen against each other, things that happen against people's property that are different. So I think the dreams are old, and that's important.
Right.
Because sometimes we get a timeline that's like attached to Ferguson or something else, right, around abolition. And so I always like to mention the Quakers because they've been at it a long ass time.
Right.
I like to mention W.E.B. Du Bois, who was talking about abolition democracy back in 1935.
And connecting that to abolition of slavery and the completion of that project, right?
Yep. I like to talk about moratoriums on prison construction and jail construction. That's a very, very important part of our history. I like to talk about the Scandinavians, guys like Thomas Mathieson and Niels Christie. I know
that's a new one. I haven't heard that one before.
In the United States, I know that, and I'm very proud that, the abolitionist politics that we see today are often attached to Black feminists, which I think is correct. And I also know that my thinking was deeply impacted by these guys. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think they theorized some really good stuff. I like to mention the International Conference on Penal Abolition, because I think that, back starting in the 80s, what they did to try to bring an international grouping of people together every couple years to talk about building abolitionist futures is really important. Then you also asked about critical resistance. And for critical resistance, I will say I was not around at the beginning. I was not around to help plan the conference.
I projected you into that path.
I was not around to help plan the conference that lit the spark for what became what we know today. I started working in support of critical resistance the following year, 1999, to help plan a regional conference that had that same name, and then to go on to help to found critical resistance as a national organization in 2001. And there are a couple things that I think critical resistance has done that are worth noting in response to your question. So the first big contribution I think that CR made was to help popularize the idea of prison industrial complex abolition, which is the kind of abolition work that I still am in service of, even though I'm no longer involved with critical resistance. So the concept of the prison industrial complex, I think, has been all twisted up, by people taking intellectual shortcuts or listening to the 13th or all of these kind of popularized things that are like, oh, that means private prisons, right? Which it does not.
Right.
I think what's still useful about this concept, even though it's been all kind of mashed up and mangled, is that one, it reminds us that focusing on the pieces of this system that aren't just prisons is important, right? So for instance, it helps us remember policing. It helps us remember surveillance. It helps us remember sentencing, right? It also, this phrase helps us remember that all of these pieces are interconnected. So how we fight cops or cages impacts other parts of the prison industrial complex as well. So I find that idea of prison industrial complex abolition to be as relevant and as important as ever. And I think critical resistance helped us do that. The second thing that I'll say about critical resistance is I think another contribution that it made was a commitment to organizing for prison industrial complex abolition and developing a praxis that could bring people into the politics by showing, not just telling. And this is, I think, very important. I think the organizing work in the service of those political ends does so much more for us in some ways than the talking work. And the talking work is important. I'm not trying to denigrate that. And I obviously do a lot of talking work. But sometimes, in the talking work, we can get frustrated. It's like, well, I just told you why jails are terrible. Why don't you believe me? Or I just told you for the 50th time why we don't need cops. Why don't you get it? And I think sometimes the organizing work that we do can demonstrate how it makes sense in the world, right? That we can actually live without more and more and more jails. We can actually live without more and more and more cops. And I think that critical resistance and a handful of their allies are, really have been crucial to demonstrating that an abolitionist organizing approach can be a winning approach. So those are, I guess, the kinds of things I would say about what's important about critical resistance coming into being.
I think also that concept of like the prison industrial complex shows that there is an economic interest being served by it, and there are very deep economic practices in it, but they're not just only about privatization. They're actually just about the economic interest that mass incarceration and criminalization are protecting and that create.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the part of that I think is the most interesting and that we also take from the military industrial complex, which is where the phrase gets, pinched from, is the kind of pervasiveness of it, right? So if we live under capitalism, we understand that, as we do, right? We understand that there are economic motives, public and private, that undergird all of this stuff. And it's the joining forces of these public and private interests to use this stuff for everything, as a remedy for everything, and in every part of our lives, that causes us the most potential harm.
Right. So last thing I'm going to ask you before I turn to Mariam, And I'm going to ask everybody this because I think it's really important what you said about abolition comes from people's lives. What was your journey personally to abolition in the context that you just laid out?
I'm going to be that guy for a second and say, I don't like the question.
I know you don't.
And I don't like the question not only because I hate talking about myself, which is true, but I also am worried in this period in particular, but I'm worried in general that the kind of personalization and the individualization of these politics leads us to what I frequently call like a choose your own adventure approach to them.
Right.
And I think it discourages or decouples people from movement work, right? From being in movement with each other and being obligated to a specific set of political principles that I think abolitionist politics at their core require. So I understand the spirit of your question is not that, but I feel
we're
like
going to come to what those principles are, and we're going to come to that.
Yeah,
question.
but I do feel like it's important to say that because I have very little interest in like what abolition means to me. It's like there is what abolition is, and then there is how I relate to it and I move it in the world. And it matters very little what it means to me. But to the question of getting there, I think, there also is the question of like, how do we get to be credible, right? Do I get to be credible because I'm a survivor of sexual harm? Does that make me a credible abolitionist messenger? Or, if you want to denigrate abolition, is my status as a professor person, which is not what I am, but is the status of somebody being a professor person, make them more credible, right? So for me, the steps toward abolition are commonsensical steps, and they are about a lot of unwanted contact with the cops as a young person. They are about really being invested in Black people's liberation and having good movement and formal education teachers help me understand what the kind of primary barriers to Black people's liberation are, and really honing in on the fact that as long as we elevate imprisonment, policing, surveillance, criminal sentencing, the barriers that exist to Black people's liberation are potentially insurmountable. So those have to be removed. And that's really, I don't know.
I appreciate both the critique of the question and you answering it. And as you said, the intent behind it is not to say that abolition is whatever I say it is or whatever one of us says it is, but it is to say that we don't just sort of hatch fully formed as abolitionists, right? And it's not just that, we take a class in abolition and then we're abolitionists, right? That it comes from our lived experiences and also from being organized into it. I
will say one other thing, if I can, I'll make it quick, is that I think I was already oriented toward abolition at this time, but through doing service work with people coming home from jails and prisons, 100% cemented it for me, because the idea of like doing this kind of short-term Band-Aid quick fix, it's like the never ending trying to stem back the tide when you do that work. And it just led me to believe we need much bigger and more systemic change.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I'm coming back to you in a second, but I'm going to turn now to Mariam Kaba. I can never remember where I first met Mariam. I know it was in 2006. It might have been at, we were both at a national DV conference, domestic violence conference, talking about domestic violence responses by police as a primary site of police violence against and criminalization of Black women, queer and trans people, and about that was why we need to dream a world that would actually create safety for survivors. Or it could have been at the meeting that birthed the Chicago chapter of Insight, which was a political home for me where my abolitionist dreams were fed in a community of Black women and trans and people of color feminists who really called on us to understand these dangerous intersections of state, community, and interpersonal violence in the lives of women and trans people of color. And in the words of the Critical Resistance Insight Statement on Gender Violence and the Prison Industrial Complex, called on us to build movements that not only end violence, but create a society based on radical freedom, mutual accountability, and passionate reciprocity. A society where safety and security will not be premised on violence or the threat of violence. It'll be based on a collective commitment to guaranteeing the survival and care of all peoples. And I'm pretty sure Beth Ritchie, who is another person who organized me and many survivors and many anti-violence organizers, wrote that beautiful sentence, but it's one that I come back to almost every day when I'm trying to remind myself what we're here about. But Mariam, countless people and generations of organizers have learned about abolition from you, whether it was through a New York Times op-ed, your Twitter account, your blogs, your writings, your workshops, and the Summer Youth Institute that you just completed with hundreds of young people from across the country. So I'm gonna ask you the same question that I asked Rachel, and I expect the same resistance, but can you share with us how you came to abolition and what some of the important touch points are in the evolution of abolition dreams and practices over the past couple decades?
Sure. First and foremost, thanks to the Allied Media Conference for putting this on as a plenary, and I'm always happy to be here. I always say that I've been coming to the Allied Media Conference since it used to be in one room. So that's a long time, and always happy to be here.
Please forget that you're an avid zine maker, so you went to
exactly.
the zine
I was here when zines were still really a thing, right? But I think taking what Rachel said, I agree. And for me, though, it was really clear that I came into abolition through my anti-violence work, particularly working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. I found that the mainstream, or at least what we call the funded side of that work, really was not responding to what people wanted. What people wanted to have happen was to find a way for the violence in their lives to end. What we were offering were orders of protection, shelters, other things that weren't necessarily the first or second choice for most people that I was interacting with. And so looking for ways to do something else, basically, I moved into learning about restorative justice. And it was restorative justice that brought me to abolition work and organizing. So I think for me, because it was clear from the beginning that PIC abolitionists are constantly asking, like, what is actual safety and what is actual justice? And how could that look and what might that feel like? And what are kind of the ways that we might build our world so that violence in all of its forms is addressed and reduced? And that it became clear, at least for me, and I think I want to say this because it's important, like there are multiple definitions of what people think PIC abolition is, and there are multiple trajectories, and there are within a big tent of PIC abolition, it's all different types of political affiliations and people who believe, in the state and other people who don't, and like all those things are happening within the big tent. But something that I have found consistent all the way through, at least when I started and came into this work, was that PIC abolitionists that I knew were concerned with ending the sources of violence. And that was how coming to realizing that prisons and policing and surveillance don't actually solve violence, that they are in fact concentrated forms of violence, perhaps the most concentrated forms of violence, and that they really are designed to bring about premature death. And so that's why you want these institutions gone, right? That having that orientation was what drew me in. The focus that people had on all kinds of harms rather than focusing on, quote, crime as defined by the state. That felt also super, just like an opening for me, because We know a lot of things that are criminal don't harm anyone, and a lot of things that are, considered that are very harmful aren't considered criminal. And if we kind of get stuck within that defined frame, we miss out on so much that's possible to shift and change so that we make our lives more survivable and livable. So that's how I came to the work.
I so appreciate so many things about what you just said. I think one is that we tend to excise police violence or prison violence from our definition of violence. So if we're saying, well, what about gun violence? It's like police perpetrate gun violence all the time, right? What about sexual violence? Police perpetrate sexual violence all the time, but we don't think about that in our conception of violence. So I appreciate that when we come at it through the lens of survivors' experiences, particularly the survivors who are Black and Brown, Indigenous, queer and trans, we see that all forms of violence are operating at the state. In fact, as Tourmaline taught me, is one of the primary perpetrators of violence in the lives of queer and trans people of color and of women of color and gender oppressed people of color generally. So that if we start to have a more global conception of violence, then we understand what ending it looks like. And I often say that if you look at experiences of policing through the lens of women and queer and trans people's experiences of policing, you get to abolition much more quickly because you see the failure of protection and you see the perpetration of violence in the context or under the guise of protection. And I think
it's worth pointing out though how disingenuous it is for so much of the conversations that get had about PC abolition, that all of a sudden the police and prison preservationists discover survivors.
Right.
Like all of a sudden that survivorship is the cudgel for why we ought to keep these systems in place when basically they've had 250 years to figure out how to be survivor-centered and haven't done it. So I find it interesting that conversation always gets brought up, very quickly as the response, right? Like, almost like a visceral response. When, survivors are not a monolith. Survivors have a kaleidoscopic view of justice. The conversation about, prisons, policing, and surveillance, it acts as though it's an on and off switch, like a faucet situation, when these systems actively harm people all the time. There is never a moment when they aren't harming people in our community. So putting, the institutions are rooted in survivors' trauma and harm in the first place, inherently so. I find it's just disingenuous what the kind of arguments are, and then they get brought up to be used as like, see, here's exhibit 10 of why these systems actually work. Well, you actually don't really care about survivors in those systems. The courts definitely don't care about survivors in that system. They're not interested in anything other than adjudication in a certain direction, if that. And also, they're there to figure out, quote unquote, how people win, right? Win a case. An adversarial system that doesn't care about truth, that doesn't actually care about justice, that cares maybe about the law if it's at its best. Yeah. So I just want to put that out there because this is a constant thing. I mean, it's,
Also, it comes in after the fact. It's not engaged in prevention. It's not engaged in systemic.
All of it. And it frankly comes in after the fact.
Right, barely. And that's the other thing, is that the current system leaves so many survivors behind, right? It leaves 43% of people who experience DV who never call the police for a number of reasons, right? It leaves behind 2/3 of people who have experienced sexual assault who never tell anyone about the sexual assault they've experienced. So we're leaving so many survivors behind. And I think it's no surprise that the movement for abolition has largely been led by women and trans people of color who are survivors. I certainly am someone who called for help when I was 8, got none, just got more punishment, looked for protection, got more violence instead, and whose mother never got protection from the state, but from networks of friends and family, whose grandmother was incarcerated, instead of being given the things that she needed. These are the realities that we're all fighting for abolition from, the real life examples that Rachel talked about earlier that bring us to abolition. So Before we bring in our friends on the, well, all of us are on the ground, but our friends on the ground in Minneapolis and Detroit and Atlanta, I just wanted to ask both of you who have been involved really in kind of answering this question that Insight and others ask us, what will actually keep survivors safe? Can you tell us, Rachel, about the work you've done with STOP and Creative Interventions, and Mariam, the work you've done with Just Practice and other ways in which you've been practicing abolition on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think that, the question, the way that you asked it, Andrea, raises a really important point for me, which is, part of what our abolitionist politics direct us toward is, as Miriam was pointing out, responses to lived harm, right? That can reconceptualize how we imagine safety, how we imagine wellness, et cetera. But they also, if we're doing it well, I think, point us away from single remedies, right? So we're not trying to replicate the prison industrial complex. We're not trying to create some shadow prison industrial complex.
Exactly.
We're not trying to put a new prison industrial complex in the ashes of the old. The idea is to kind of transform radically both our conditions and our responses. And so I think, part of what our best work is around addressing the needs of survivors is not trying to create a one-size-fits-all kind of remedy, right? So when you tell people, well, what if you didn't call the cops? Or when you ask people, well, what if you didn't call the cops when something happens? Then sometimes you'll hear, well, what are you going to do instead? As if there's kind of a one-to-one correlation. And I think part of the work that I really appreciated coming out of Creative Interventions, and part of what I really appreciate about Mimi Kim's orientation toward the work, and I got to say Mimi's name because I know that she's a folk hero, AMC folk hero, and the founder of Creative Interventions. But part of what I appreciate about her approach to doing this is to really think about it kind of as an organizer. What's your goal? And with the idea that every single goal is not going to be the same, right? I really liked how you said that, Miriam, that survivors have a kaleidoscopic vision of what justice might be, right? And for some people, for most people, acknowledgement of harm, some kind of apology, and some kind of guarantee, whether or not it's enforceable, but some, movement toward non-repetition, right? That somebody's not going to continue to be harmful is really, really important. And that might look really different how that is played out. So the work of the Storytelling and Organizing Project, I think, was partly to help us catalog, if you will, right? Like what that variety of things might look like. So it might look like something elaborate and many years in the making, trying to kind of go through agreement about what actually happened and what should the kind of repair be. Or it might be something really small, like if we can fix this one little thing without trying to bring the entire system to bear on it, we might be able to shift somebody's behavior. We might be able to increase somebody's well-being. And I think that's really, the work that we did both through Creative Interventions and through its kind of daughter project, STOP, was really about that, was trying to think about like what shifts the conditions enough to increase people's ability to be well in their homes, in their communities, whatever. And then also to kind of push out the idea that, one, all of us are capable of doing that. So it's, it doesn't have to be a cop, but it also doesn't have to be a social worker who can take some amount of action in relationship to harm. And that, two, all of us are obligated at a certain extent to be involved in creating the conditions that we want. So if we don't want more violence, if we don't want more harm, then we need to take some amount of action. And we need to be willing and able to take some risks to do that.
Right.
And I think we are living in a fantasy world if we think that if we think using the cops is not risky, right? I think
Right.
anybody who has encountered the cops knows that involving them is risky. So this idea that that you can only actually have a safe so-called system if it involves cops and cages, I think it's just BS, honestly. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I would invite people to read a book called Invisible No More if they want to learn about just all the risks that are involved there. So, go on, and then I'm going to go to Mariam.
Yeah, and so I think that the practices, just to be a little bit more detailed about that, the practices can look like having people in your home to create, some kinds of buffers between you and somebody doing you harm. Or if it's street-based violence, if you spend a lot more time on the street than you do in a home, to have people around you who can help create some kind of buffer between you and who might do you harm. And we know from experience that there is more safety in numbers, even if there are 2 of you, even if there are 3 of you. And I reject the idea that people have no one, right? I think, that's part of, the other work that we did through creative interventions is like, if you can't think of somebody off the top of your head, it doesn't mean that there's not anybody. Let us help you build out your capacity to think creatively about who there might be, including people maybe you don't know, but who are committed to this kind of approach. And then the last thing that I'll say is that I think there's a big difference between you not being familiar with something and something not existing.
Right.
I am so tired of hearing that there are no alternatives, that there is nothing else, because people aren't familiar with what there is. And I also reject the idea that, like, in some small town, you can't get what you need, or in some rural area, you can't get what you need. In fact, I would say in those kind of places, people often have a lot more practice looking out for each other because the kind of ability to call on the cops is not as quick, right? People can't come instantly. Even if the cops were a good remedy, they wouldn't be able to get to you as quickly.
Right. Mariam, I often hear you ranting against this notion of an alternative to the PIC in the ways that Rachel was just talking about, and also reminding us that abolition is in our hands, that we don't need to delegate this to state actors who will police us in one way or another, that we need to practice this ourselves and also unearth policing inside ourselves. So tell us about how you've been doing that for years, building people skills and infrastructure for people to be able to do that.
Sure. Well, I think that for me, that comes from the notion that I have, which is that, for me, PIC abolition is a vision that we enact through ongoing struggle and practice. It's not some sort of blueprint, but it's actually another world in the making. And so we're going to make our way collectively through experimentation, through organizing, through rebellion. That's, to me, very critical to what I have rooted my own abolitionist vision and practice within. And that I've been part of lots of kind of collectives, formations, projects over the years, and most recently part of Just Practice Collaborative with Shira Hassan, Dina Lewis, Rachel Kydor, and co-founded with Kisa Reynolds and Anna Mercado. And all of those folks have had some experiences themselves doing work within funded traditional anti-violence spaces, and I would identify in some ways as survivors of violence themselves, and realized and recognized that we need to create lots of different kinds of ways for us to support each other through those kinds of harms, which are going to be inevitable in the system that we currently have. So the question is how do we actually practice to get better at our responses? And that's a real re-education process in multiple kinds of ways. I do want to say something briefly before we transition. well, two things. First, for folks who are interested, Just Practice will be having what we're calling dropping a TJ mixtape that will start in August. That will have a series of 9 workshops that people can take online that are from anyone, Transformative Justice 101, Harm Reduction 101, PIC 101, other things that we keep getting asked about, but that none of us has the time to actually devote to because we have day and night jobs in addition to all the other things we do that are our political commitments. So look out for that. And if you go to the Just Practice site, you'll be able to find more information about the mixtape. That's a concrete way that we're trying to help disseminate more information, knowledge, and ideas that people can use and make relevant. I'm going to end for my part with just saying that a very useful lesson that we on the abolition side really can take from the police and prison preservationists is that they're never despairing and they're rarely discouraged. Okay, I want to say that to people because I think on our end, these folks have had 250 years in the US at least, and $1,000 million trillion to achieve their goal, which they say is public safety. We know that's not actually the goal, and but let's take them at their word for it today. They've had everything thrown at them that they get, yet here we are, still engulfed in interpersonal violences. Okay? With all that they've had, time, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And on our side, though, we're told that we're unrealistic and unserious when we've had no resources to implement our visions of safety and of abundance. So why should we be the ones discouraged and despairing? Why should we assume that the demands that we produce, kind of urgent blueprints to, quote, solve violence, are in good faith? They aren't. Because if they were serious, they would give us $250 billion a year to, quote, experiment, right? And short of that, it's that their demands are unrealistic and unserious. So it just so happens that I'm a PAC abolitionist who happens to like making things. So I'm trying to make tools, including organizations that can be added to our abolitionist toolkits. But I do so not because I'm motivated by the demands from the preservationists, but because I want my communities to survive.
Right.
Okay? And I want to contribute to that survivability. And I want to address harms. That's why I'm doing it. Not because I'm trying to prove shit to any other side. Not because I'm responding to their what about this questions.
You actually want us to be safe. You actually want us to be safe.
I want safety, and this ain't it. that's the short version of that. So I think I wanted to make sure that we say that pretty clearly.
Yeah.
Because I don't understand where our discouragement and despairing comes from when these people should be damn discouraged and damn upset if what they say they want, which they say is public safety, they haven't been able to achieve with all the resources at their disposal and all the years and all the patience and all the time, So we've got nothing on our end. People are giving people $10,000 grants and telling them to end violence. Oh, come on now.
And yet people have been able to make things happen on the ground. So we're going to come back to what these central organizing principles or key political commitments are for abolition. I definitely want to make sure we get to that question, but let's bring in folks on the ground who have, with nothing, been helping us make our abolition dreams real from Minneapolis, Atlanta, and Detroit. So now we're pulling in some voices from folks on the ground. I'm just going to go straight to you, Miski. You're with the Black Visions Collective. You've been leading the uprising in Minneapolis that has sparked this current moment of imagination and practice, and that has really pushed possibilities to abolish police and move us forward. Rachel and I were at a conference in January where we were talking about building a movement to abolish police. And we were thinking about like, a years long trajectory. And then y'all just pushed us through a portal into fast forward. So tell us how that happened and how in that context you and other people you're organizing with came to abolition.
For sure, yeah. So time isn't real, right? Let's go. Yeah, I want to just give us a grounding of like Minneapolis, right? And really the Twin Cities being a tale of two cities and not Minneapolis, St. Paul, right? The Minneapolis really gets touted as one of the most livable cities with the best qualities of life, the Minneapolis miracle, right? But that's only really true for white people. We have some of the worst disparities in home ownership, in wealth, in education between Black and white folks. And Minneapolis has really served as this poster child for reform in ways that really make it clear why abolition is the way forward, right? Because before there was George Floyd, there's Philando Castile, and there's Jamar Clark, and there's Christopher Burns, and David Smith, and Terrence Franklin, and Marcus Golden, and Fong Lee, and so many others. And on top of that, Minnesota has the fourth biggest employment gap between Black and white folks. One of the largest disparities in home ownership at 76% versus 24%. And in 2019, we were ranked as the fourth worst metro area for Black people in the United States. And these disparities are actually mirrored in the Minneapolis Police Department. Black folks account for more than 60% of the victims of Minneapolis police shootings from 2000 to 2018, while we make up just 8.8% of the population here. And of all the on-duty fatal shootings that have happened, the only officer to actually be convicted in decades was Officer Mohammed Noor, who was a Black Somali officer who killed a white woman, Justine Ruzick, in 2017. And her family received a $20 million settlement from the city, right? And so the hypocrisy in the sentencing and the outcome of that further illuminates the ground here in Minneapolis. And Minneapolis has really tried, right? Tried reform. Changes include having former police chief Janae Harteau, who's an Indigenous woman. The Minneapolis Police Department receiving a review from President Obama's Department of Justice, right? And there's even a settlement that the police department here received so that officers would not actually hold detainees in prone positions to teach them how to not do that. And that's the exact way Officer Chauvin murdered George Floyd in May, right? And right now, currently, we have a Black police chief. And with all of these efforts that Minneapolis has made, they've still managed to continue to murder Black people and continue to have police terror on the necks of all of the people here in Minneapolis. The one thing that Minneapolis was able to do through community pressure was actually shift $1.1 million from the police department in 2018 and get that reallocated to community-based safety initiatives.
So y'all have been defunding the police since before this moment. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, yeah, it's those efforts, it's those community efforts that have actually got us to this point, right? Whether it's been direct action and disruption in the streets, including an 18-day police occupation of the 4th Precinct 5 years ago when Jamar Clark was murdered, takeovers and shutdowns of highways and the governor's mansion. We have a history of sustained and disciplined uprising in the face of police murder. Many of us were there, and there's a strong movement memory that we carry with us into this time. There's been narrative intervention, right? MPD 150 led a 150-year performance evaluation of the Minneapolis Police Department in 2017, where they were actually sharing the past, which includes the history of the department, the roots in the removal of the Dakota people from this land, the breaking up of labor organizing, attacks on Black people, and their long history of reform. And then also the present, which includes stories from people who are interacting regularly with the police department, and also the future, which is actually inviting people to imagine a future without police and putting abolition more on people's radar. And then our campaign to get that $1.1 million out, right? Things like that, organizing like that actually seeds the ideas and puts that into the atmosphere for people so that it's in the air and so that folks can really understand that Black organizers and other abolitionists have been talking about divesting from police and investing in our communities for a long, long time. After George Floyd's murder and the uprising, people picked up those ideas and really had it resonate with them and started to have like a whole lot less patience for reform. And then we saw the uprising, right?
Because y'all had tried them all, and y'all had, I mean, done every action to try and make it stick. And you had done, I mean, the piece that you're talking about, this history that you're talking about, I just really want people to sit with like how much organizing was part of that, right? Like none of that came out of, someone wrote a paper at one of the local universities and that's how the movement got there, right? Like that is a progression that you all made from calling for prosecutions to demanding just accountability in the broadest possible way, which is to defund the police department.
Yes, 100%. And that's what's been most exciting about what's been happening here, to actually see our people taking abolition from theory into practice and actually providing for each other. So whether it's making sure that there were fire extinguishers and Narcan on every block, doing medic trainings, actually having food drives and banks for people to actually take care of each other, actually having community patrols, because we had National Guard and white supremacists on top of the police in our neighborhoods, right? This uprising where our city burned and crowds of mostly young and Black and brown people were being attacked. This was really a referendum on policing in our city. And really the dynamics of doing this in a so-called progressive city, right? In 2018, we thought we had one of the most progressive city councils, but they would barely touch the budget. And we just saw this week, right? At the same time that we're pushing this charter amendment, we're inside the budget process in the city of Minneapolis. And they did the same thing where they only took $1.1 million out of the police department and put that and had that reallocated to the Office of Violence Prevention. So it's still not visionary enough, right? It's an uphill battle and the outcome is uncertain, but we know that we're further along than we've ever been before and than we ever thought we'd get to be. And so really, yes, resonate with what you're saying around this being an opening.
We're so grateful to you for pushing us through it and also for pushing your council members, because I think they this idea was like, oh, they just decided that they had done enough with reform and they were going to do this. And, I know that y'all are pushing hard and demanding accountability from the people you elected to represent people in the city.
Yeah.
And that this charter change, which would require, the charter of Minneapolis now requires the city to have a certain number of cops. And so in order to move forward your abolition dreams, you have to change literally the structure of the city. And you all are unafraid, unapologetic. You're just going for it. You're saying this is what we want and this is what we're going to get.
Yes, 100%. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, the charter amendment is really about being able to change the infrastructure of what's possible in the city. The way it's written right now, we can't have, based on the amount of residents in Minneapolis, we can't have less than 730 police officers in our city. So we got to get this charter changed so that we can actually change the scale and the scope and the power of the police and how many of them are actually in our city, so that we can invest in the infrastructure that will give life to our communities.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm getting a note that all of us are getting very excited about what we're talking about and our abolition dreams, and we are speaking very quickly, and we want to make sure in our abolitionist dreams that we leave no one behind, including folks who are using interpretation and our own selves in terms of listening and hearing what we're saying. I'm going to come to you, and I'm the guilty party. I'm number one fast talker. Tony Michelle, I'm going to come to you as the executive director of the Solutions Not Punishment Coalition, who in your very name have been organizing for abolition for years in Atlanta and have been reminding us, along with so many people, that so many of our communities, and particularly queer and trans communities, sex working communities, criminalized communities, disabled communities, migrant communities, have been practicing safety outside systems of policing and punishment for so long, precisely because they're primary perpetrators of violence against us. So what does that look like in Atlanta in this moment? And how did your journey to abolition play out in that context?
Yeah, it's just so good to hear Miss P just talk about all of the work that has been happening in Minneapolis. Similar to Minneapolis, Atlanta has been an uprising from really combating oppressive, ridiculous laws that keep us in danger in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic with our governor, Brian Kemp, to the senseless murders of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta at the beginning of June, and shortly after 8-year-old Sequoia Turner. We have been shaken, like so many other cities in this time. But like Minneapolis, in so many places, we have been organizing over the years, really starting in 2013 when there was a banishment ordinance that was introduced to the Atlanta City Council to banish folks who were charged with prostitution, particularly Black trans women. That was when we first saw really a collaboration amongst people of trans experiences, folks who are queer, cis heterosexual folks, really came together to fight against that banishment ordinance. It was really a moment where we knew that this actually impacted so many of us in so many ways. And in order for Atlanta to truly shift into this, cradle for the civil rights movement, that we had some cultural shift work to do. And I think that, in the South, right, when we're talking about defunding police, we have to be really careful because we are combating a deeply rooted a framework around what it means for Black people to be safe. What does it mean for Black people to be silenced? To be silent in order to be safe, what it means for us to create our own formations and small pockets in order to be safe, how to participate in capitalism and in order to be safe. That is what we are really fighting against as a Black metropolis, right? As a queer metropolis, we are experiencing so many folks, just so many questions, so much pushback around our claims and dreams to defund police. And so in this moment, we're, as organizations like Southerners on the Ground, Women on the Rise, SNAPCO, Southern Center for Human Rights, we've all been trying to figure out the best ways in order to really reach our folks. And bring them into our narrative, and bring them into movement, bringing them into a space a safer place to reimagine. So that's been really the context of the cultural context of Atlanta. Policy-wise, like I said, right after the death of George Floyd, we saw the world, go into an uprising. In Atlanta, went into its own uprising in regards to the murder of Rayshard Brooks, who was shot outside of a Wendy's parking lot by an APD officer. So many folks, I'm sure, have seen the video multiple times. And what we saw was this police officer, using more force, right? He shot Rayshard. He went up to Rayshard. He kicked Rayshard, right? And it really put Black leaders in Atlanta into a place of not in the ways that we want them to, like expanding their imagination, but again, to use their power to figure out how to reform these situations. And so Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms put together a police use of force task force that was really focused on, again, what are the things that the city should, to provide some recommendations about the ways in which the city can reform police and also reform our police use of force statutes and standard operating procedures. So in the past month and a half, or 45 days, we've been in that work. just recently, last Monday, the police use of task force, police use of force task force. So many words, honey.
So much force.
Yes, it's a force, right? Task force
Right.
came together to. We released a community survey around people's attitudes toward policing. We had over 3,000 folks participate in that survey, where we found that in our Black city, exactly what we know is that our people don't feel safe. And we also know that and we also found, just as abolitionists, as strategists, as creatives, how hard it is for our folks to reimagine police or reimagine the ways in which we keep ourselves safe. And so we have released those recommendations. In the same breath, while the police use of force task force was happening in the past month and a half, we are also challenging the city council to respond to, again, Ray Sharp Brooks. And so Council Member Antonio Brown, who is an openly bisexual council member, the first openly queer council member in Atlanta and Black, introduced a bill called the Ray Sharp Brooks Bill, where we were demanding that the city reallocate $73 million to community initiatives that, again, will support different kinds of safety models for our community. And we, about 2 weeks ago, we had over 1,200 city council, we had over 1,200 folks call in in support of the Ray Sharp Brooks bill. We had over 18 hours of footage when folks just calling in and telling and sharing their support. And so we, again, have been organizing and will continue to organize in this time. I think the biggest takeaway for us now is, again, like I mentioned before, it's just how do we bring the Black folks who do not understand that it will take all of us to win, what it will take for them to join us and to hear us and to see us in ways that they have not before, and also in ways that they have not been able to do even for themselves. And Rachel talks about, kind of the community talk and how we're talking with our people, how we're creating barriers in our family units. And so it's like, how are we really reaching the culture and shifting it in a way? And I'm excited about it, right? Atlanta, we're the home of the trap, right? We're the home of trap music and sex and the Freaknik and Magic City. And so we as Black folks have practiced autonomy and self-determination in so many ways in our city. And so I'm so excited to continue to be a part of that culture shift and really hold spaces for folks to practice more ways in how we respond.
I think that you are definitely one of the people I think of when I think of people who are making abolition abolitious, both in terms of the joy of the practice of abolition that you bring, but also when I've heard you speak about how much like organizing for abolition is about the conversations you have with your cousins, your aunties, your siblings, the people in your community. And I know that that's part of the organizing too, right? That people aren't there necessarily, but you're helping to move them there in everyday conversations and also through culture. And also just appreciate what you're saying about there's an aspect of the civil rights movement that's been about sort of trying to make the system work for us. And then there's been another aspect that's been about trying to tear the system down and build a new one. And I feel like what you're describing in Atlanta is a battle between those two visions of Black liberation. So yes. I'm so grateful that you are leading that fight. Going to come to Tawana in another Black-led city who's fighting policing and also the sort of the policing that happens without the police, the surveillance that happens through data collection and other kinds of surveillance. So Tawana, tell us about what's happening in Detroit around that.
Yeah, thank you. Shouts out to Ally Media Conference and to you all for being so brilliant and kick ass. And so I just want to say that I come out of a city that has been suffering under surveillance at least my entire lifetime, and not just from law enforcement, but from the entire world. We've had one dominant negative narrative because we're a black ass city. We got, right now we currently have over 500,000 Black people. That's 80+% of our population. And prior to that, we had at one point we had over 90% Black folks in our city. And so I grew up in a city where I was used to us being profiled and tracked and traced and monitored and criminalized on a whole scale, a mass scale, like the entire city. And so that has allowed for particular types of policies to go forward with very little resistance from the outside of Detroit. So Detroiters are proud. We come from a very long legacy. I'm standing on the shoulders of Jimmy Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs, and Dr. King's first "I Have a Dream" speech was here, and Malcolm had his roots here. And organizing here, the message to the grassroots speech, and just so many other things come out of this space. And so I want to lift that up. But I also, in thinking about surveillance in Detroit, I want to lift up the work of Simone Brown, right? And talking about the 1700 lantern laws, right? And so one of the programs here in Detroit is Project Greenlight. Project Greenlight is literally a real-time crime surveillance program that now consists of over 2,800 cameras in 700 locations. In addition to that, we have traffic lights that are monitored with facial recognition. We have drones that are flying through the sky with those capabilities. We have law enforcement officers that have access to these surveillance cameras and facial recognition on mobile devices. And every single person who's ever taken a state ID or a driver's license in the state of Michigan since 1999 is in a facial recognition database. So that means that you are literally in a perpetual lineup every single day of your life, hoping that you are not accused of a crime and misidentified. And so we know that 2 people so far have already been misidentified by this technology. So the policing has been automated in Detroit to a degree that a lot of folks have not experienced yet. And we understand that if we do not resist this in Detroit, this black ass city, that there isn't going to be much hope for the smaller Black cities or Black and brown communities that it'll be replicated in. And so I'm understanding that there is no separation in resisting facial recognition and mass surveillance with abolition. And so I really appreciated hearing Rachel and Miriam keep saying that surveillance within the framework, because I always find myself on the outs of trying to organize against mass surveillance and facial recognition as someone separate from abolition work. And I understand that the origins of most of our interactions with law enforcement is surveillance. Somebody was being voyeuristic towards us. Somebody was profiling us. Somebody was targeting us and tracing us and following our movements. And I'm super emotional today because I got on this call right after talking to my niece, who was followed around by an old white guy with a screwdriver because she was in a neighborhood that he didn't think that she belonged in. And that happened today. And so understanding that these are the purveyors of these systems are not just within law enforcement, they're in our social services institutions, they are in our schools. Our children are walking through metal detectors and being profiled and tracked and traced all day. Any sort of resource that we need is being tracked to some sort of surveillance. And so I'll just say this, I know we're running up on time, but Detroit, prior to COVID-19, the median income in this large metropolitan, beautiful Black city was only $29,000 a year. Since COVID-19, almost 40% of the residents in our city have lost their jobs. And so we're looking at quality of life crimes being increased. And the only solution that people seem to figure out is to add more cameras, add more policing, add more tracking and criminalization. And they can't seem to figure out how to add more resources. It's really almost comical to hear so many people stand up against defunding as if they don't know what the hell that means when our schools have been defunded, when our water systems that would provide affordable water for communities have been defunded, when our recreation has been defunded. And so if we're talking about flipping that on its head, putting those resources back into community and resourcing neighbors so that we can look out for each other and not watch each other. And so the mass surveillance and the criminalization has now been put on steroids by things like Ring Doorbell. Our individualization that has allowed for us to internalize these systems is as adding other layers of policing that we don't talk about a lot. And so it really is doing that radical revolution of values that Dr. King talked about, so we can remove some of these things within us that would make us call on police in the 2020. We still calling police as a first line of defense in our communities when we know that they don't create safety. They've never created safety for us. Surveillance has never created safety for us. And I'll just tell people as I end this, we a hashtag surveillance ain't safety. Follow that. Let's keep having the discussion. This is ongoing, and I believe that we will win.
We will, because of people like you and because of Detroit, where the AMC and its visionary abolition dreaming has always been deeply rooted since 2007. So I really want to lift up this thing you said about we need to be watching out for each other instead of watching each other, and mobilizing that where we surveil each other, then we mobilize the power of the state behind that in the way that we've seen so many white people doing forever, and certainly recently in some high profile cases. So I understand that we have been gifted an extra 10 minutes so that we actually have 20 more minutes to be in a conversation together. I'm going to reserve 5 or 6 at the end to ask you all a closing question. But in the next 15 minutes, I want to ask us, and just I'm going to start with you, Rachel, but then invite people to jump in, kind of this question about what we're trying to abolish is not just police or just prisons. It's what Rachel referred to as the prison industrial complex. And in many ways, we're trying to abolish policing, not just police. And then that means it's not just people in police uniforms that do that. There's a whole range of ways that policing happens in the ways that you were just describing, Tawana. So Rachel, you referred earlier to central organizing principles or tenets of abolition. I understand one of them to be, we're not trying to transfer the function of policing from police to another institution, but that we're trying to abolish policing as a practice and the values that produce it. Can you tell us other things that you feel like are really central organizing tenets, and then I'll come back to everybody else.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just that we're not trying to shift policing. I think it's that for any aspect of the prison industrial complex, and this is true of cops, cages, cameras, courts, right? All of those. We're not trying to extend the life or the scope of them. So we don't want to give them anything that allows them to harm at a greater scale or over a longer period of time. We're not trying to give them any more resources of any sort. And I don't just mean financial, I mean bodies, I mean technology, I mean space to exist. And we're not trying to give them any more legitimacy. So if we're doing things that don't undercut the system's ability to talk about how it's necessary, we're also not kind of meeting those obligations, I don't think. So those are the 3 big ones for me, and they go across all 4 C's: cops, cages, courts, cameras. And cameras, obviously, Tawana's point, I think, is a really important one. Sometimes we forget human surveillance is as, damaging as any of the technology that's used for surveillance.
And that makes sense. Sorry, go ahead.
But I guess just we need to continue as much as possible. So no extension of the life or scope, no more resources, and no more legitimacy.
Thank you. It makes me think about what you often talk about, Mariam, the soft police. How are we legitimizing soft policing when we sometimes as we move away from what we understand to be policing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think those are a lot of police theorists have spoken about the concept of soft policing over the years, and I think it's very insidious, and it's very sometimes it even feels invisible because of the fact that Rachel says this a lot, but it is true, and it's true that part of the work, like the PIC actually does work and like in all the ways that means it works to do the things that it's designed to do, and it also works on our on disciplining us and disciplining our imaginations so that we are the ones enacting the logics of punishment, and kind of being ruthlessly effective at doing that with each other, and calling it other names. And I think that is a hard thing to dislodge, frankly. And I'm not sure how we're going to do that, because it's so seductive. Punishing people feels very good. So does revenge. Fantasies, they feel good. That's why we have them. And to not acknowledge that is to be in a position where we're constantly asking ourselves, well, why are people so down for this? Why can't people let go? What is the, it makes sense that people can't, because there is a liminal pleasure at seeing other people harmed when you've been harmed. And I think that's not something we like to talk about publicly enough, but it is just true. You see it all the time. We saw it in the Colosseums. We saw it before then. This is a thing amongst human beings. So we have a lot of work to do to dislodge soft policing and to dislodge our desire and love of inflicting punishment.
Right. So it brings me to sort of asking everyone to sort of share. We've heard some of the obstacles that we're facing and some of the ways that we're overcoming them. And one is this obstacle of imagination, right? The cops in our heads and hearts, the ways in which propaganda teaches us that, okay, maybe we shouldn't have a uniformed armed police officer do something, but we should have a social worker do it, or a mental health professional do it, or that we should do it for each other, that even if in our community-based responses to violence, we will be policing each other. What are some other sort of barriers all of you are facing on the ground in your cities, or in talking or thinking about or organizing or creating tools towards abolition, and how are you overcoming those?
Well, I mean, I could tell you one of the barriers is having crime, actually, quote unquote. Let me put that in air quotes. And not having the consistent narrative that there are quality of life issues that need to be addressed, and always having to combat that as a narrative, in trying to seek resources for community members. I stand as an abolitionist, as someone who is a survivor as well, and that is not going to be an excuse to me to ramp up policing in my community and not be looking out for my neighbors. And so when you have been in a Black city for your entire life, that is a everyday struggle. Every day you have to prove your humanity, not just to yourself, but to the outside world and to folks who are constantly being bombarded with a dominant negative narrative. And so I think that Miriam is right about how difficult it is to be in a situation where, if you have experienced harm, the default is these are the systems that exist right now. So we're going to use these systems while they exist right now. And then when something new is put into their place, then we'll shift. And we can't do that anymore.
Right,
we have
right.
to absolutely be engaged in the alternative vision right now.
Right. I often hear people say, like, well, when you can show us the alternative, then we'll switch. And it's not just city council members who say that, it's people in our own communities, right? And it's like, no, we're all responsible for building that, is what we're saying. And that abolition doesn't mean lack of accountability. It actually means more accountability, and more likelihood of prevention and transformation of conditions. Miski, Tony, Michelle, do you have things that you're struggling with on the ground and ways that you're finding your way through with them?
Yeah, I can give just like two quick examples. One of the things that has been really amplified by the uprising here is the housing crisis. And there's been a whole sanctuary movement here in Minneapolis where unsheltered people have been organizing and demanding places to live that aren't the traditional institutional shelter system, which is punitive, right? And so what does it mean for us to come up against the very few resources that actually do exist to provide support to our communities, but for them in of themselves to be punitive for our folks. Just this week, 24 folks were arrested for demanding no evictions on stolen land here in Minneapolis. And so those are some of the ways folks are actually moving and organizing. Encourage you to follow Minneapolis Sanctuary Movement to learn more about that. And then I think another thing is, many of the resources that we have built up until now have really been entangled with the police force, right? Even the Office of Violence Prevention that we have has to work with MPD in some ways. Mad Dads and other domestic violence organizations that have really important programming that prevent domestic violence also work closely with the cops. So how do we help the abolitionist portions of these programs actually grow? Because we really, really do need resources that are equipped to deal with violence and do offer alternatives, while actually also being able to challenge and support these folks in our community to disentangle themselves from Minneapolis Police Department and the institutions that are killing us. So
thank you.
Offerings.
Thanks. Tony, Michelle, how are you creatively
I'll just
meeting
go
those
ahead.
obstacles? Oh, go ahead.
No, I want to hear your question. I'm sorry.
No, just how are you creatively meeting the obstacles that you described earlier on the ground? How are you shoving your vision through them?
Yeah. So first, just want to just offer one of the barriers. I think that one of the barriers definitely have been, again, how to really get folks in on the ground. And I mean, simply trans and queer folks, right? Atlanta, again, is a Black city, and, sharing a personal experience, SNAPCO has definitely been in a part of leading so many of the quote unquote reforms, right? And the organizing work that's been on the ground in the past 5 to 7 years. And it is us being able to collaborate together and keep each other safe so that we can show up fully to the work, so that we can show up fully to the movement. And it is, I think Tawana talked about it, just the crime, but it's the interpersonal harm and violence that happens at protests to trans folks, right? It's the interpersonal harm that's happening to women at the protests, or young folks or Black men who are being sexualized, right, at the protests. I mean, it is how are we, again, being with each other, being with each other differently, in a way that promotes trust, and that really sets the ground for deepening, for a deepened work. And so so interested in that. And I think that some of the creative ways, we kind of hinted to it a little bit. It's just the cultural work. It's the music that we share. It's the joy. Black folks, we come together in a different way. Everybody come together. We know we're about to have some joy, right? And so it is how we are being really creative and delicate in the ways that we experience joy, and how we're being strategic, and how we're sharing those experiences.
Thank you so much, Tony, Michelle. Okay, I'm going to close before we end, and Tawana's going to take us out with a poem, but I'm going to close this part of the conversation by taking a page from the Writing New Worlds plenary. People in the past, including perhaps some of you sitting on this virtual couch, on this virtual stage, have spoken and organized this moment into existence. And so I want to ask you all to say in 1 minute each what you want to speak into the future. If you could speak to AMC 2030, and you are speaking to AMC 2030, what would you tell them, Rachel Hertzing, in 1 minute or less?
course, you make me go first. 2030, what would I say? I would say congratulations on using that window in 2020 really well. You know, I think I was complaining to Miriam about this earlier. I feel grumpy right now that we are wasting this opportunity that we are in. I'm so excited to hear Miski talk about all of the stuff that you raised, because I feel like a lot of eyes are on Minneapolis right now. And even if we get it wrong, so-called, it will have been a really, really good rehearsal for whatever is next. And I think we're seeing that in what we're hearing Tony Michelle describe. We're seeing that in what we're hearing Tawana describe. And so for 2030, I want us to be able to look back and say that we made the absolute best use of this limited window that we have available to us.
Thank you. Mariam, your message for 2030 AMC.
I think I would just say that congratulations on figuring out so many things by actually working to build another world. So, yeah, congratulations. We've figured out a whole bunch of stuff now that will take us into the next stage of our ongoing struggle. So that's what I would say.
Thanks. Miski, you're speaking to AMC 2030. You're saying the spark ignited in Prince's hometown.
Listen, thank Prince. Okay, he told y'all the revolution would start in Minneapolis. Now all of you know how to say Minneapolis correctly. No. I want to say, yeah, congratulations and thank you for staying in it. I think so much is possible in 2020 because of what happened in 2014. And so I'm excited for what's possible in 2030 and beyond. And thank you for staying connected and adapting and experimenting, and congratulations. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks. Tony Michelle.
I would take my mask off on stage. I would take my mask off, and I would start a chant, and I would start a song and drop a beat, start twerking and say, shout out to yourself because you're awesome. Shout out to yourself because you're great. Shout out to yourself because you're the motherfucking shit who kept this movement going all damn day.
Yes.
That's what I would say. And I would ask everyone to join me in a team.
Yes, twerk some. Yes, twerk some.
Excellent. I really hope that I will have learned to twerk by 2030. Before I turn it to you, Tawana, I'm going to send my message to AMC 2030. And I'm going to send it as the Capricorn I am, who always wants things to go exactly right, and say, congratulations that you have raised children that don't know what policing is, and that you did it by practicing and failing and learning and practicing and failing and learning and experimenting and stepping out and trying new things and doing that in public and doing it in ways that weren't always cute and that were messy, but that ultimately got us to this freedom place. And that's what's required, and just grateful to people for challenging themselves to try that and not sit by and wait for the perfect thing to arise and then join in, but to actually get our hands dirty and get it done. So thanks AMC 2030, and thanks to all the AMCs that led up to this moment that contributed to making this moment possible. And I just really want to lift up the AMC organizers, the dreamers, the people like Jenny Lee and Mike Meadow and Diana Nucera who dreamed AMC as it is now back in 2007 when I first started coming, where I began to see and believe in abolition as a practical reality from coming to the AMC in Detroit and seeing what Detroit was doing. So take us home, Tawana, with your message to AMC 2030 and a poem to close us out.
Yeah, I'm going to say to AMC 2030, thank you for seeing each other. Thank you for coming back to the front porches. Thank you for coming from behind the surveillance cameras. Thank you for tearing down all the walls and all the systems that sought to destroy us. And I'll see you there. They try and erase us rename us, displace us. But we ain't faceless. Our bodies are here, bold, black, beautiful. We shed tears from the sweat of our ancestors, bask in the glory of their resistance. The blood in our veins is of legends, doctors, poets, musicians. We will not be nameless. They cannot shame us with their propaganda, demand our silence through their genocide. We will not go quietly into the night. We carry the fight of Joe Louis, got the black fist to prove it. We are warriors and artists. The innovators they call arsonists in October. They run us over when we resist them, but we're persistent. Abolition in our ancestors' dreams, and we will not stop until all the walls come crumbling down.
Let's get to dreaming new worlds and waking up every single morning to bring our abolitionist dreams into being. Thank you for joining us.